Spending spikes in Europe and Asia as global weapons sales hit record highs. At almost $3 trillion in 2025, the defense industry gained big from geopolitical upheaval and years of war. So should we heed the numbers as a warning of more conflict to come? Or could the spending serve as a deterrent that encourages peace? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is global weapons spending. Well, the SIPRI Institute has completed its annual study of global military expenditure, and it's a sad indictment of our collective failure to secure peace in much of the world. Though total spending increased only by 2.9% over 2024, in Europe it rose 14%, and in Asia, 8%. The biggest expenditures still came from the military giants, the US, China, and Russia, but the US actually spent significantly less on weapons in 2025, mostly because it cut assistance to Ukraine. Here's a look now at who's investing what in war.
The world is rearming at a pace not seen in decades. A new report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute shows global military spending hit a record high in 2025, extending a decade-long surge driven by wars, geopolitical tension, and uncertainty. From Ukraine to the Middle East and across Asia, governments are pouring more into defense, responding to conflict and preparing for what may come next. And it's now the 11th consecutive year of growth.
The trend we saw marks another year of wars and increased tensions around the world. And that's also shown by the fact that the military burden, so the share of global GDP dedicated to the military, is the highest we've seen since 2009. So everything points at a world that feels less secure and is spending on its military to compensate for the global landscape.
Here's how the spending is spread globally. The United States still leads, although its share is gradually narrowing, largely because no new military aid for Ukraine has been approved, even as spending rose elsewhere. China follows with a steady and long-term military expansion, and Russia, where defense spending is increasingly driven by war. But the bigger picture is broader. Spending is rising across regions. Countries are now devoting a larger share of their economies to the military than at any point since 2009. And the main driver of that is Europe. Military spending across the continent has surged in 2025, the fastest growth among European NATO members in decades, as governments respond to the war in Ukraine and growing doubts about long-term US security guarantees. Germany is at the center of that shift. Now the largest military spender in Europe, Berlin is increasing its forces, boosting recruitment, and reshaping policy with ambitions to build the continent's strongest army. For NATO, the increase reflects a deeper shift in how allies see their own security.
For too long, European allies and Canada were over-reliant on US military might. We did not take enough responsibility for our own security. But there has been a real shift in mindset, a collective recognition of our changed security environment.
The trend is also accelerating in Asia. Spending across the region is rising at its fastest pace in years, driven by regional tensions and growing uncertainty over US support as countries respond to China's expanding military power. And for the United Nations, the concern is not just how much is being spent, but where this trajectory leads.
For the first time in decades, the number of nuclear warheads is on the rise. Nuclear testing is back on the table, and some governments are openly mulling the acquisition of these horrific weapons. Have we forgotten that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought?
The logic is familiar. Spend more to feel safer. But as weapons multiply, so do the risks of miscalculation and the cost of insecurity. Because in the end, the question is no longer how much the world is spending on defense, but what the spending is preparing the world for.
Let's get a better look now at some of the conclusions in SIPRI's report. And joining me from Stockholm, researcher in the Military Expenditure and Arms Production Program at SIPRI, Lorenzo Scarazzato. Thank you so much for being with us, Lorenzo. So military spending has really been increasing for years now. Tell us what you see as the main instigators of that spending, and does it bode well for our global security?
So as you said, in 2025, we saw another year of wars and global tensions, and that meant that global military spending reached the highest level we have ever recorded. There's been 11 years of continuous growth. So we're talking about 2.9 trillion, almost 2.9 trillion US dollars. The main trends, the main drivers have been Europe. So the growth in Europe and the growth in Asia and Oceania. That's perhaps surprising, since that the fact that the US dropped. We recorded a drop in the US due only to the fact, maybe a technicality, the fact that they halted military financial aid to Ukraine that we would count under the US military expenditure. But if we were to take the US out, it means that the world, the military expenditure of the world, grew year on year by 9%. So the trend is fairly unambiguous. We're seeing a trend going up. Whether that makes the world safer, well, that's open for debate, in the sense that on one hand, we see how military expenditure can provide deterrence. If we look, for example, at Ukraine, they're spending 40% of their GDP on their military, and that is not an abstraction. For them, it's about survival. On the other hand, though, we can see how this trend can provide escalating tensions, can lead to further rearmament, and therefore increase the cost of any misuse or misperception.
Okay. Well, let me ask you something interesting I noticed in the report, because spending as per share of GDP is now the highest, it said, since 2009. So what were the factors that drove it to that previous high 17 years ago as compared to now?
That's correct. Also, we need to remind ourselves that 2009 is the year straight after the 2008 economic global crisis. So that meant that a contraction of GDP, so the denominator there meant that MILEX as percent of GDP increased as a result of the fact that the economy shrank.
Okay, so I was thinking more in terms of when Russia went into Georgia and occupied that territory there. So completely dissimilar to now.
It's two different trends, in the sense that we've seen some rearmament in Europe starting from 2014, so later on.
Okay. Now, you noted that U.S. military spending, of course, decreased because of cuts in assistance to Ukraine. But do you expect that to change?
Well, we've already seen how for 2026, so the current year and the next year, there's been some budget requests, some already approved, for when it comes to the US, for a military budget up to 1.5 trillion US dollars. So that would amount to half of the current global military expenditure. So that's likely to change, yes.
Okay, but I guess finally, what do you actually make, though, of the argument that bigger, better funded militaries actually deter leaders from starting wars? Because the other argument is, why spend on military if you're not going to use it?
That's exactly the point, in the sense that the risk there is, once you have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. The fear here is that there's going to be a new normal where countries feel the need to increase their own military expenditure, and their adversaries do the same. There's the new normal doesn't make anyone safer. Instead, we step onto a spiral where escalation is the new norm.
Okay. Lorenzo, we're going to have to leave it there. That's all the time we have for this segment of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank you so much for being with us. Well, let's broaden out the discussion now and welcome three new panelists. Joining me from Jakarta, Senior Policy Advisor at the Australian National University's National Security College and former official in the Australian Department of Defense, David Andrews. From Helsinki, President of the Delphi Global Research Center and retired U.S. Army Colonel Robert Hamilton. And from London, Director of the Global Stability Network and former Director of the British American Security Information Council, Paul Ingram. Thanks all so much for being with me. David, I'll start with you. Given the latest numbers, do you think we are witnessing an arms race here? And if so, where does this culminate?
I certainly wouldn't use the term arms race, but I think we're seeing a sort of a natural response and correction to a long period of probably relative underfunding of defence by a lot of countries. So looking at things from the Indo-Pacific, where I'm sitting, there's definitely a response to the actions of China in particular, and states feeling, I think, concerned and threatened by their actions. Particularly, we're talking about countries like Japan and the Philippines, who are facing the brunt of Chinese maritime action, but countries like Australia as well, or Indonesia, where I am right now, are having to respond to a very changing, very much more complex regional security dynamic. If looking at Europe, then clearly there's a response that has to be made to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and many European countries' support for Ukraine. So that's leaving large gaps in their inventories that have to be refilled. But I wouldn't necessarily frame that in an arms race context per se.
Okay. Then, I mean, David, quickly, does it worry you, or do you just kind of think it's a bit of a needed correction in investment?
Look, I think we do obviously have to be cautious that we don't just pursue more and more military expenditure for the sake of it. I think it can be occasionally easy to sort of run away with more and bigger and more high-tech equipment that we think will somehow solve all of our problems, when actually it's a complex web of statecraft, diplomacy, international partnerships and institutions. It's not just the role of defence to maintain security and peace and stability around the world. They employ a very obviously critical frontline dimension of that, but they're just one piece of the larger puzzle. So I think it is important that we follow a level of restraint in that, but a necessary caution. But it's entirely understandable to me, given the particular circumstances we find ourselves in.
Okay. Colonel Hamilton, do you agree there? Because, you know, there are some that really see this trend as quite menacing.
Well, I do think that, yes, there was underinvestment by some countries in defense, and particularly in Europe, where we focus at Delphi, we focus on Europe and Eurasia. And it's been a long-standing U.S. critique of its NATO allies. It didn't start with the Trump administration, that NATO allies have underfunded and underinvested in their own defense. And so at the NATO summit in 2024, the allies agreed to a 5% target for defense spending of GDP, 5% total of GDP, of which 3.5% would be on what they call core defense, and then 1.5% of that could be on things like military infrastructure that has military utility. So part of, I think, what we're seeing, especially in Europe and in Eurasia, is a reaction to the war in Ukraine. So you're seeing Ukrainian defense spending rising, Russian defense spending rising, NATO defense spending rising in response to that, and then U.S. defense spending rising. But the rise in U.S. defense spending, I think, probably has as much to do with domestic reasons and sort of the specific objectives of the Trump administration than it has to do with security in Europe or security in the Indo-Pacific region or the Middle East.
Do you see it, though, as a strategy, Colonel, of peace through strength? And I stress peace through strength, or do you worry that there's going to be the motto of, you know, if you're not going to use it, don't spend on it?
Yeah, so peace through strength is the Trump administration's bumper sticker, and of course that's borrowed actually from the Ronald Reagan years, the 1980s. It was a Reagan slogan. So, I mean, if you look at the budget the administration submitted to Congress, which is about $1.5 trillion, which is a 45% increase over this year's budget, which was already the biggest it had been in real terms in many, many decades, at least since the Cold War. My assessment of it is it's as much about vanity projects like the Trump-class battleship, which at a very minimum is a $1 billion just to launch the ship. And it's probably $20 billion project total in terms of total costs associated with it. And you could argue that that we're underfunding in the U.S., despite the fact that we've submitted a $1.5 trillion budget. We're underfunding the things that we really need. We're missing the lessons of the war in Ukraine. And we're also underfunding things like Tomahawk cruise missiles, Patriot PAC-3 interceptors, which we've burned through at a really furious rate in the war with Iran. And those need to be replenished. And there's no simple way to replenish them because the supply chains and the precursor chemicals and the rare earth minerals and all the things that go into making these really highly capable weapons take a long time to produce, and the supply chains sometimes are not under control of the U.S. So there are some serious problems with the U.S. defense industrial base that a $1.5 trillion defense budget is not going to solve.
Huh. And by the time they would even get replenished, it could be just too late anyway. Let me turn to Paul, though, as the only European here on the panel. Do you think Europe needed to up its military spending? Because that's where a huge part of these numbers are coming from.
Yes, well, I can see I'm going to be an outlier in this conversation. No, straight answer. I think there is a huge shift towards a militaristic way of thinking. This concept of peace through strength, I would translate for your viewers as dominate or be dominated mentality. So the idea essentially that the US and its allies need to be able to dominate every potential adversary or challenger to their position in the world. I think what we're seeing is a China that is coming up in terms of its influence, and we just don't like that. We don't want China to challenge us, and we don't want a multipolar world because this reduces our ability to determine outcomes. And we dress this up in a liberal agenda. We dress this up as a sort of as a defense of self-determination and a defense of those within other countries that agree with our way of life. But frankly speaking, as a world, we face increasing global catastrophic risk, which demands for our very survival cooperation across ideological divides. And that is not what this is about. This is absolutely about an arms race in order to maintain our dominance. And I don't think that this is a recipe for stability at all. So we need to be thinking much more in terms of non-military tools for achieving the stability through mutual vulnerability.
Okay. And as you talk about self-determination there, Paul, I mean, is more spending making Europe more independent, or is it actually more dependent on the United States because many of its weapons will come from U.S. suppliers?
Absolutely, yes. No, it's exactly that. We are seeing a shift towards a mindset, military-industrial complex incentives here, where defense and technology companies are working hand in hand to dominate the space, not just the battle space, but the commercial space. And so the increase in military spending in Europe is actually deepening our dependence on the United States. And unless we are genuinely willing to move away from that dependence, I think it's a recipe for increasing confrontation with those states that seek to challenge that US dominance. And you know, it could be so different if we were to genuinely negotiate with the Russians rather than issue them with ultimatums. I believe, having had these conversations with many Russians and Chinese, I believe there would be an open door to exploring how we can develop a much more balanced relationship.
Okay, Colonel Hamilton, I could see you agreeing with a large part of Paul's analysis there.
Until we should negotiate with Russia. Paul, I don't think you're an outlier in a lot of what you've said, at least with my view. So I do think that, yes, investment. So this is a classic, in political science terms, I think we're seeing a classic security dilemma play out here, where one country invests in its own defense, and it knows that it is investing for defensive purposes. It is investing to increase its own security, and it doesn't necessarily have aggressive designs on neighbors. But the neighbors don't know that because they can't see inside the minds of the leaders of country A. And so country A's investment in its own security threatens country B, then country B raises its military spending, and then you do get this spiral. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now. And then the other part of where I would agree with much of what Paul said is, you know, the real irony of what we're seeing here is the country that built whatever you want to call it, the rules-based order, the liberal order, but the system of institutions, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, and NATO, the United States built them largely, or is the driving force behind them, and is now either burning them down or walking away from them. And we know those institutions are imperfect. And we've known for 2.5 decades that the UN Security Council needs reform. But walking away from it or burning it down is not the answer, because that just gets us into a great power competition world order, and every great power concert has ended in great power war. And I fear that's where we're headed, actually. I will say that I do not believe there is space to negotiate with the Russians. Russia needs to be defeated in Ukraine. That's the only outcome that will guarantee European and American security. Russia is the only existential threat to Europe and the United States. It has the capability to destroy them with its nuclear arsenal. It is reckless and irresponsible in the way it uses military power, and it threatens nuclear war multiple times a week. And the only way the Ukraine war can end in a just and stable peace is Russia's defeat.
Okay. Paul, if I have time, I'll let you comment on that in a second. But let me come back to David, because, and another sign of truly changing times that Colonel Hamilton was alluding to there, I have to ask you a little bit about Germany. I mean, that is the one country after World War II that many did not want to see building a bigger military, yet they're a leading spender now. What does that say to you?
I think we're seeing the same thing with Japan as well, is that Japan sort of constitutionally was limited to a self-defense force, and we're now starting to see a slight expansion of the scope of what that entails, to include the export of frigates to Australia and weapons elsewhere as well. So we're seeing both Germany and Japan sort of pushing back in that direction. I think the potential for stabilization from within Europe is something that, at least I, speaking as an Australian in the Indo-Pacific, am a little bit jealous of, because there is a European community of states within the EU, within NATO, of which Germany is obviously a leading economic and military component, that gives them the potential over a period of time to establish a level of strategic independence and to operate maybe not fully without the role of the United States, but be much less reliant upon that. Now, that's not really a luxury that we have in Australia and in large parts of the Indo-Pacific, so it's quite a different strategic environment. But I think it's, in that sense, a positive development that, alongside France and the United Kingdom and others, that the Germans are looking to take a larger role in securing European defence and taking on some of that role for themselves.
Okay. Paul, we're down to kind of our last minutes, so just one last issue I'd like to touch on with you, and that is one of your specialties, the nuclear issue. How much does the rise of nuclear warheads and testing, spoken about in the SIPRI report, worry you at this point in the context of what's happening?
Well, it worries me deeply. I mean, we are right in the middle of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York, and states seem to be far more interested in criticizing one another rather than seeking to progress the obligations that they have legally to engage in nuclear disarmament negotiations. And I reject this idea that is pushed so frequently that other states are somehow hopeless when it comes to any conversation or negotiation. I would say this if I was in Russia. If I was in Russia, we need to negotiate with the US, despite its shortcomings. Russia has huge numbers of shortcomings, but there is an agenda here to talk about, and it's critical for the survival of the planet that we do talk about it. And there are good reasons. They're not. They don't explain Russia's outrageous behavior, but there are good reasons for its behavior that we don't actually put our attempts to understand better how we treated them in the 1990s and early 2000s, how the NATO-Russia Council was stacked against them right from the start, how NATO expansion has caused them to feel this threat, how their relationship with Ukraine is very different from other parts of Europe. These are all things that we need to understand better, and we're not. Instead, we are ploughing our money into militaries, and particular expanding our nuclear arsenals, and nuclear risk is going up just at the point when global catastrophic risks of all kinds are expanding, and we need to talk.
Okay. Colonel Hamilton, just a minute for your final thoughts there.
Sure. So this is the Russian narrative, right? And I've heard it thousands of times over 20 years. That the U.S. and the West tried to keep it down in the 1990s. The truth is, the U.S. put hundreds of billions of dollars of aid into Russia in the 90s. Was it enough? No, of course not. But much of it was stolen. NATO enlargement. Look, the reason the Baltics, the Poles, and all the other what we now call frontline states, the former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact states, were beating on NATO's door to get in, was they understood that Russia had imperial pretensions that it had not shed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine war is part of that, and the war in Georgia was part of that, and the Transnistria occupation, and the wars in Georgia in the 1990s that Russia intervened in, and so the pattern of Russian intervention in its neighbors far predates even the first discussion of NATO's enlargement.
Okay.
So I just don't think you can blame NATO enlargement for these wars when the wars were occurring or Russian intervention was occurring before NATO enlarged.
Yeah, we will have to watch that space, and I'm sure we'll be rejoining all three of you gentlemen to discuss developments further in hopefully not the too near future. But for now, that's all the time we have for this discussion. So I'd like to thank you all so much for joining me and our viewers for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We will see you next time.